Today's 4090 launch day. Well, 4090 FE review embargo lift day. Launch day is technically tomorrow. I have spent dozens of hours playing with these cards now, and I'm gonna tell you right now, this is one of the most unique launches I've had the, I don't know if I wanna say necessarily privilege, to be a part of in the last 10 years. We've got a lot to talk about today.
We interrupt this video to bring you a special message from iFixit. No, we interrupt this interruption with this interruption about new stuff from iFixit. Wish you had a new graphics card but inventory sucks? Fix the inventory problems with iFixit. Whoa, don't drop it. Can't fix that with iFixit. Just kidding, yes you can. Wish you could take iFixit with you anywhere but your pockets aren't big enough? Introducing the new More
and the new Minnow.
Take them with you anywhere. So get iFixit for your loved ones or just get them for yourself.
So, company politics aside, when we look at a review, and when I say company politics, I mean like, do you like NVIDIA as a brand, right? If we talk about the product and the product specifically, we have to look at it with a very specific mindset. One, what is the product designed to do? Does it do it? Is it worth it? Now, worth it is gonna be a very subjective thing. Price and value is very subjective. So we look at it in a perspective or a lens of what do you get for that same amount of money this time versus that same amount of money last time. So we kind of look at it that way. Then we look at things like power draw, power limitation, overclockability, all these things that people may or may not care about that add value to the product. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this. And 4090 being one of the more controversial launches, just coming off of the cryptocurrency, I don't want to say crash, but Ethereum definitely moving to proof of stake versus proof of work, which means GPU mining essentially is done, at least for Ethereum, until the next big coin comes along that uses GPUs, just like Bitcoin, and same process, it's gonna happen again. RTX 4090 is an interesting prospect because it's a smaller process, it's extremely dense core, over 16,000 CUDA cores, third generation RT cores, DLSS 3.0 capable, lots of different facets to a graphics card. And then you can go super deep dive and start looking at its renderability and its calculations when it comes to things like 3D modeling and just, there's so much to talk about. So when it comes to comparing it to cards, it's an interesting choice because remember, 4090 is launching prior to AMD's RDNA 3 launch coming in November. And so I think NVIDIA this time around was trying to just kind of do like a shock and awe, let's just push the performance as far as we can out of the gate to just have any, just to try and shut down AMD being anywhere near the performance of an RTX 4090. Remember, the 6950 XT and the 6900 were very close to the 3090. In fact, the 3090 Ti pretty much existed because of the 6900 XT becoming so close to its performance over driver maturity. So in terms of the cards we compared it to today, this is the FE embargo. So you'll see AIB embargo launch or lift tomorrow, which is where you'll see custom cards compared. We're comparing it to an EVGA 3090 Ti. The reason why I'm not comparing it to an FE 3090 Ti is we were never sent one. In fact, I don't think NVIDIA really sent those to anybody. So we used the EVGA card, which I feel is a pretty good mid-range, mid-ground in the AIB. They didn't go stupid crazy on the size of the cooler and all that sort of stuff. They just went with a bigger cooler designed to handle the 450 watt TDP that was present on the 3090 Ti. I remember, I think it was what, 350 watt on the 3090. So it's 100 watt up from a 3090. We compared it to an ROG Strix 3090. I have a 3090 FE, but that's being utilized right now. And I found that the Strix on all stock settings performs actually very, very close to an FE, maybe a % or two higher at the most over an FE. And that's just because of the fact that the cooler is able to keep it a little bit colder, which makes that turbo clock or that boost clock logic stay in a bin or two higher most of the time. And then for AMD, I compared it to the PowerColor 6950 XT Red Devil. 6900 XT testing is actually still ongoing because of the fact that one of the things I had to really do with this launch was I had to completely rethink our testing suite. I had to get rid of, like 80% of our titles, bring in new titles, test RT, no DLSS testing this time around, no FSR 2.0. I didn't add any of the upscaling tech that these cards have available to them. We are just testing raw performance. And then we can take a look at software in another video, which I plan on doing a DLSS 3.0 as well as an FSR 2.0 and comparing, because that's a buying point for a lot of people. So let's go ahead and just show you guys the numbers, and then we have a few things to talk about that are both objective and subjective. So if those benchmarks tell you anything, it's that the 4090 is the biggest performance uplift we've seen generation on generation yet. Now, there's an asterisk here that needs to be talked about. Typically, we would see the 80 series card launch first, then the 90 series card launch after it, and then potentially the 70 series card come a month or two later again. So if we look at 30 series, 3080, 3070 were launched or announced alongside each other, with then Jensen taking a 3090 out of the oven, if you remember that keynote. And basically it was like, oh yeah, we got this bigger thing here, and it was a later discussion. 3080 launched, then 3070, then 3090. And so if you compare 3080 to a 2080 Ti, they were closer together in the performance. So if day one they had launched 3090 compared to a 2080 Ti, that performance difference is quite a bit greater. But if you take a look at the performance uplift, generation on generation, the uplift of the FE over the 3090 Ti is anywhere between 50 to 77% average FPS. That is absolutely bonkers, because this is the part where I say it's gonna be objective and subjective. If you look at this purely on a pricing standpoint, when 3090 Ti launched, it was a $2,000 MSRP. $2,000 was the cap that NVIDIA was allowing the cards to be sold at. So it didn't matter if it was a Kingpin or a Strix, they were all $1,999. If you compare the 4090's $1,599 MSRP versus the $2,000 launch price, yes, I'm very aware you can get a 3090 Ti today for $1,000. So that's where I'm like, okay, if we're talking about launch pricing, price to performance on a 4090 is so much in the 4090's favor. But if you take into account now $600 more than a $1,000 3090 Ti, which are actually getting harder to find, by the way, if you look online, they're starting to get scarce, because that whole like allowing the market to correct, allowing inventory to correct that NVIDIA said that they were gonna manipulate is starting to have effect. Prices haven't crept up, but they are becoming harder to find because they are just sprinkling them into the market. Then the performance value of the 4090, and I hate to see value on anything that costs $1,600, but it's there. This is $100 more than a standard 3090 was. So if you even compare what the launch price of a 3090 was to a 4090, it's even greater. It's even a greater gap and a better value. However, again, you can't use launch pricing because of the fact that 30 series is readily available at a much lower price, where typically in a launch, we would see the previous generation had been strategically unavailable prior to the launch of the 40 series, making the 40 series or the newest series be the only thing available. And then you're stuck with used market to buy anything, which you wouldn't compare used pricing to, because a lot of people, it's like, do you want to buy a new car or a used car? There's a whole mindset there regarding new or used on what you're going to spend your money on. If you're a performance snob and you're like, I need the highest FPS, I need the highest amount of horsepower a graphics card can give me, and I don't care what it costs, then 4090 is absolutely, there's kind of no question right now compared to what's available currently with RDNA 2. Depending on what RDNA 3 brings, 4090 is an absolute monster. And you know for a fact, we already reported on what the full die size is versus what's in 4090. There is room for a 4090 Ti, and they're probably gonna see one. It's gonna take a little while, maybe 6 months or more, depending on adoption rate. But we know that NVIDIA is sitting on a mountain of 40 series silicon. So the question is, how long is it gonna take them to start building up that product stack? Now we got some nuances to talk about here. Let's talk about Shadow of the Tomb Raider, no ray tracing. 0% GPU bound at 1080p. That's a no-brainer. I don't typically test these cards at 1080p, but I really wanted to start seeing where the bottlenecks were because of the fact that a lot of people run a very high refresh rate 1080p panel, 240 hertz, 300 hertz. And so I wanted to see now with our 12900K overclocked, what's the bottlenecking like? Well, 0% GPU bound and then 4% GPU bound at 1440. So you can see how even a 1440p panel now, depending on the title, starts to become extremely bottlenecked as well. Guardians, interesting because it seems to be about a 201 FPS cap. So we start seeing like 201 in 1440 and 1080. So we now know we're hitting engine cap with the performance of these cards, especially the 4090 is so high. 3090 Ti though, it's interesting because they saw the same type of cap where it was 182 FPS and 183 FPS 1080p versus 1440p respectively. So it's interesting that the 4090 was able to achieve about 20 or so, 18 or so FPS higher, but the same sort of cap. So I don't know if that's just better frame pacing or what it is, because you would think if the 3090 Ti was hitting the bottleneck at a certain number, the 4090 Ti would be the same, at the same rate, or the same number, but it's not. With ray tracing, it's the same sort of cap, just about 170 FPS. So basically, if you're running Guardians of the Galaxy, a 4090 is far too powerful for that, even at 1440p. 4K, no problem whatsoever running that, even with ray tracing on. Hitman 3, 100% bottlenecked. It's weird though, because the 4090, how I talked about how in Guardians had a higher bottleneck cap, where the FPS where it was bottlenecked was higher than the 3090 Ti, this was sort of the opposite. The 3090 Ti and 3090 were higher average FPS in that bottleneck number than the 4090. So again, it's probably something to do with the draw calls on that particular title versus the way that 4090 draw calls are happening at a hardware level. So again, bottlenecked, but at a lower FPS, which is interesting. Metro Exodus 1080p, very bottlenecked, even with ray tracing on. It's the first time we've ever seen turning on a title at ray tracing at native resolution, even 1080p, just bottlenecked. That's because of the 3rd generation RT cores that are on the 4090. The other note I really had on here was just the fact that the 6950 XT really likes Shadow of the Tomb Raider non-ray traced. This architecture, RDNA, does really well with Shadow. Same thing with Horizon and all that. It just performs really well at the same level as a 3090, 3090 Ti, and in some of the titles, even as high as a 4090 if it's really heavily RDNA optimized. Which gives me a lot of hope for RDNA 3. Anything with ray tracing though, you can see the 1st generation RT cores on AMD really are behind NVIDIA's 2nd gen RT cores and way behind 3rd gen RT cores. But again, RDNA 3 is only a month away, so all of this information regarding AMD versus 4090, it's all obsolete in about 3 weeks. So keep that in mind. This is the part now where there's some things I want to talk about. And I actually was having a back and forth conversation with NVIDIA. They just weren't getting it. They say I'm making a big deal out of nothing, but I don't think it's a nothing, so I'm gonna bring it up regardless of their opinion, and I basically left it at, we're gonna agree to disagree, we're not gonna agree on this, conversation's over. If we take a look at the 12-volt high power connector on the back of the 3090 Ti, when it's in the system, like this, there's no cable coming out that way, pointing towards your side panel. It's pointing towards the rear, which initially when I saw this, I was like, oh, that kind of stinks because that means you're adding length to the card to make the bend. Well, if you take a look at the size of this card versus something like the Strix that we showed, this is actually a very reasonable size. The length is not that bad, it's just extra thick. And you can make that radius. You just might interfere with some of your front fans or AIO depending on the length of your case. NVIDIA talks about a published spec where if the plug is right here and it has to make this bend, then what you're dealing with at that point is extra card height this way towards your side panel. And my concern about them reconfiguring the way that it is on the FE card to being parallel with the PCB means when it's in your case, it's very heavy. When it's in your case, it's pointing towards the side panel. Now that exists on pretty much all these cards, but you've seen the way that like Strix handles it is it recesses the power plugs in there. So they take some of that depth away from the PCB height by building it lower. You can see here that the PCI Express cables, which are not the 12 volt, very high, almost at horsepower, the very high power cables, they point towards the case as well, but the card overall is not as deep. But what I want to show you is the problem is not with necessarily the connector and the fact that it points towards the side panel, it's the way that the adapters are. This is the adapter that comes with the Founders Edition card. It's the same adapter that also came with our Strix card. If you're gonna use a separate cable, for other manufacturers that are making custom cables, I don't know if this will exist. This is like a thick fabric wrap right here. It's not a heat shrink, it's actually a fabric wrap. And what that's designed to do is alleviate as much bend happening on the connector right here. What I couldn't seem to get through to NVIDIA, even though I kept mentioning this, is they seem to think I was worried about the connector being damaged by being bent. No, I'm not concerned about that. What I'm concerned about is the fact that I already showed in my review, this connector is wiggly. That means as you torque on it, you see it's got a fair amount of wiggle on the PCB itself. So if you put this in your case, and then you just start wrenching on this cable, it bends the connector and the whole assembly where it's soldered to the PCB. So if you are not careful and you plug this into your system and you go to cable manage and you just start yanking on this cable and you don't, so when I put it in our system, when I'm using an Asus Republic of Gamers Helios case, it is massive. It has got extra depth. It still touches the glass with the bend. So unless you come in here and you like pre-bend this, which I have to do, which again, makes me uncomfortable. Oh look, as I'm pre-bending it too, like the wrap's starting to come out. See this right here? Because as you radius, it makes it longer, right? So it pulled it out. It touches the glass with this bend right here. And then you got these ugly things sitting there. I mean, you could go all kinds of different ways. NVIDIA's response was like, well, we published what the minimum radius height would be in case specs. And it's like, well, okay, only a few cases on the market are gonna be able to clear this without putting this kind of bend on there, and most people are not running that sort of case. They don't see this as a problem. They said the excuse, which I'm using the word excuse very dramatically here, by turning the connector this way, in fact, if I grab this 3080 here, the 3090 is the same way. Do you see the way that the cable is? So if I plug this connector in, which I can't because it has the sideband connector, which doesn't exist on there, but it would be coming off like this. Check that out. If you were horizontal, you could run it along your thing. It's not sticking out like this. It's like this, which gives you more clearance. The 3090 is the same way. 3090 Ti is actually this way. Then you're not putting that level of bend on here. I wouldn't have so much, and they said that the reason why they turn it this way is it allows for a bigger cooler. Well, I looked under here, it's hollow. It's hollow under there. What you would lose at the very least is a half a fin. Not even a half a fin, like a quarter of a fin to turn it this way. They basically told me, well, the 3090 Ti FE was the same way and you didn't have a problem with that. And it's like, you didn't send one. So I only had to go off the EVGA card coming off the rear, which to me was a much better compromise to make than sticking it out the side of the card. Especially when you start considering the height and of these custom cards. We already showed with the Strix card. So my recommendation to you is, if you're gonna bend it, just know that the heat shrink might pop out, but you have to bend it. It will not clear the side panel if you don't. Bend it first. Hold it tight right here with your fingers. Bend it first as best you can. The reason why they put this wrap on there is to protect the pins where it goes in, okay? But don't bend it with it attached to the card. You might snap your connector right off the PCB. I'm telling you, mine wiggles. There's nothing NVIDIA can tell me or say that's gonna make me not concerned about somebody somewhere breaking their connector off because they plugged it in and then they started yanking on their cables. I don't recommend you do that with anything. The difference is the PCI Express, the previous gen, they're just way more beefy, way more robust, and they don't have that heat shrink there. You can bend them right at the connector, which is still not good, but that allows for a tighter bend. It's just the sacrifice that was made by the PCI spec going to such a small connector, which means smaller pins and more fragile in terms of being able to bend. So they've had to put this wrap on there just to give it more rigidity. So that out of the way, yes, it's something that has existed And it's still something that I'm concerned about. I can't for the life of me understand why NVIDIA would argue with me about this being a concern of causing damage. Because I guarantee you break this off and you send it back to NVIDIA, they ain't gonna honor your warranty. They're gonna say you damaged it. I'm just trying to make you aware of that. Deal with it. You got no choice but to, be careful there. It's not a bad thing to call out NVIDIA. Now, a little blurb I wanna make here about power. I am doing a separate video about overclocking, power draw, all that sort of stuff. The stock power draw is 450 watt. So it is the same as the 450 watt found on a 3090 Ti. So in terms of your power supplies and stuff, if it's capable to run a 3090 Ti, it's capable to run a 4090. A lot of the custom cards are allowing for an additional power spec up to 600 watt because that is the spec of PCI Express. But there's some interesting findings when you start playing around with those sliders that we'll talk about in another video. It's completely different this time around. Our limitations, where they are and why they're there, are not the same as what we're used to seeing. And that's kind of exciting, which actually means extremely high core clocks. Because out of the box, this 4090 was clocking an average of 2740. Spoiler alert, the Strix was over 2800. But I did mess around with the sliders a little bit. It took me less than 5 minutes to get this thing to 3 gigahertz. And I know that Jensen talked about 3 gigs and conventional cooling. Speaking of cooling, the temperatures on this never exceeded 62°C. That actually really shows that a lot of the big, giant, robust cooler designs really aren't necessary. That's one thing I agree with NVIDIA, is they said that in their mind, I don't know why they're going with such big old coolers. It just doesn't seem necessary because it's still the same 450 watt. Just because the spec is 600 doesn't mean that they're gonna pull 600. And we'll show you in the overclocking video why speccing the cooler that high was pretty much completely unnecessary, especially when the FE, like I said, in a closed enclosure was hitting 62°C, factory fan curve, didn't do any sort of manual touching of the fans with MSI Afterburner. And if they're getting this much more clock speed, this much more performance out of the same wattage, it does show a pretty impressive efficiency increase when it comes to Ada Lovelace. Moving forward, in terms of performance, until the 4090 Ti comes out, this is the biggest, baddest motherfucker you could possibly buy when it comes to a graphics card. And this uplift is typically what we'd see from generation to generation is about a 25% to 30% uplift. I think I saw 33% in a couple titles with testing like 3080 versus 2080 and 2080 Ti. NVIDIA has built a hell of a machine right here. It means a couple of things. One, performance and uplift in the past has been artificially limited, or they just made one hell of a breakthrough. Or at least TSMC made one hell of a breakthrough with this process. I guess that's the dilemma you have. Do you feed the green machine some of your money to have the highest performance? Do you wait to see what RDNA 3.0 has in store? Or do you just buy a 30 series? That's the options you have today, and you know what? They're good options to have. I just can't wait to see if RDNA 3 is gonna be able to compete, or if NVIDIA just allowed the performance uplift to go so much farther ahead than where we've expected it to go. I expected 35% more. Can RDNA make up that gap? They were pretty close here. These two right here, the 6950 XT and the 3090 and 3090 Ti, this traded blows. It was like Ali and Frazier. It was a good fight. One won, and then the other guy won. It's just like, seeing Ali get knocked out was kind of neat, but seeing the rematch was also just as exciting. So what's gonna happen now in November? Sound off down below what your GPU buying plans are. I'm curious to see. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.